The Nixon Freeze. A lot has been said about it, but not much has been sung about it, at least until now. This month, Cope Report presents The Nixon Freeze Blues, a song written and recorded by Woody Woodbury, president of Rubber Workers Local 760 in Evansville, Indiana. Local 760 was on strike for 2 months last year. The wage increases its members won through sacrifices on the picket line were wiped out by President Nixon's freeze and Phase 2.
Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. Oh Richard, I cannot get my breath. My pocketbook is empty and there's nothing left. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. I walked on the picket lines for almost 60 days. We finally got a contract and they gave us the raise. But you came along and froze it for 90 days or more. Oh Richard, I'm a-getting mighty poor. I went down to buy a car right after the freeze. But when I opened up my pocketbook, all it did was sneeze. Now the car will have to wait until I get my raise. Although the one I'm driving, it has seen better days. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. Oh Richard, I cannot get my breath. My pocketbook is empty and there's nothing left. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. Now you came along with a thing you called Phase 2. But when I got my paycheck, I found it wouldn't do. The things that I'd been waiting for to buy when the freeze was o'er. Things that went so dead burn high, my raise wouldn't buy no more. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. Oh Richard, I cannot get my breath. My pocketbook is empty and there's nothing left. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. The big shots at the factory, they're giving me the bird. They went and got the raise before you gave the word. Now I'm telling you, Richard, if this freeze don't fall, when election time comes around, it'll be donkeys in the fall. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death. Oh Richard, I cannot get my breath. My pocketbook is empty and there's nothing left. Oh Richard, you're freezing me to death.
Additional copies of this cassette with the song The Nixon Freeze Blues can be obtained from National Cope for $1.50 each. Write to Cope, 815 16th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20006.
It's not a pleasant picture, but let's look at the actual record. Now, this is not propaganda or idle rhetoric. This is the actual record of 38 months of the Nixon administration from United States government statistics.
Let's look at the Nixon record with AFL-CIO President George Meany. First, unemployment.
Unemployment. January 1969, 2.7 million, or 3.4% of the labor force. March 1972, 5.1 million, 5.9% of the labor force. Major industrial areas with substantial unemployment. The Labor Department figures a major industrial area with substantial unemployment is where the unemployment is over 6% in that particular city or area. In January 1969, we had 6 such areas. In March 1972, we have 55 such areas. Number of people unemployed, 15 weeks or more. January 69, 334,000. March 72, 1,224,000.
Many more only working part-time because full-time work is not available to them.
Number of workers employed part-time because full-time work is not available. January 69, 1,647,000. March 1972, 2,416,000. meaning 769,000 more in this category. And this is a time when the workforce is growing. January 69, number of workers engaged in manufacturing, 20 million people. March 1972, 18.8 million people. A loss of 1.2 million manufacturing jobs, again, I point out, at a time when the total workforce is growing. Number of workers in contract construction down 200,000 from January 69 to date.
Prices have also been going up.
Now let's take the Consumer Price Index. In the 3 months, November and December 68 and January 69, just prior to the start of the Nixon administration, the increase of the Consumer Price Index was at a yearly rate of 4.7%. In the 3 months, December 71 and January and February 72, the Consumer Price Index is going up at a yearly rate of 4.9%. In 1 month alone, February 1972, it increased at a yearly rate of 6%.
What about the poor?
Another item, the number of people below government-defined poverty line. The most recent information from the United States Census Bureau registered the first increase in this category in 10 years, a rise of 1,200,000 people in that period. Another item, the number of people in this country receiving public assistance. And I think this is really a very, very important item, and it's a very disturbing item, because we're getting to the point where you begin to wonder how many people we're going to need to keep one person on welfare. And we're getting to the point where it's going to put us in a real dilemma. Well, the last month of the Johnson administration, January 69, we had 9.9 million people on welfare. October 1971, the last figures I have available after 2.5 years of this administration, we have 14,700,000 people on welfare. An increase in the number of people in that 2.5 years receiving public assistance of 4,800,000 people.
What's happened in foreign trade?
Then we take foreign trade. The year 68, we had a surplus of 837 million. In January 1969, in 1 month alone, we had a surplus of 70 million. But in the year 1971, we had a deficit of 2 billion. The first annual deficit, I said before, in 79 years. The deficit for February 1972 was $597 million, or at an annual rate of well over $7 billion.
When Nixon came into office, there was a budget surplus. The rest is history.
Now let's take a look at the budget. I'm sure we heard people 4 years ago talked about balancing the budget. This was a great emotional objective of some people. Well, for the fiscal year ending June 69, there was a federal budget surplus of $3.2 billion. This was the last Lyndon Johnson budget. A surplus of $3.2 billion. For the fiscal year that ends June 72, the President estimates a budget deficit of $38.8 billion, and for the next fiscal year, 73, a projected budget deficit of $25.5 billion. The actual deficit this year will be somewhat lower than the official estimate, while the actual deficit for fiscal 73 will probably be greater than the administration's projection. So the overall estimate will probably hold. In the 4 fiscal years of this administration's budgets, from fiscal 70 to fiscal 73, the combined budget deficits, according to the President's message to the Congress last January, will be $90 billion. And this budget deficit is at a time when the size of the armed forces is being reduced. This combined deficit in these 4 years is 70% greater than the combined budget deficits in all of the previous years from fiscal 47 to fiscal 69. Well, how is that for a record?
Yes, how is that for a record? If you want to do something about it, you first have to be registered. Get registered. Learn the issues and the record of the candidates. Then, on November 7th, you can do something about it.
Donkeys in the fall. Oh, Richard, you're freezing me to death. Richard, oh, Richard, I cannot get my breath. My pocketbook is empty and there's nothing left. Richard, oh, Richard, you're freezing me to death.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
This month on Cope Report, our microphones go with George Meany, president of the AFL-CIO, as he tells senators why labor opposes compulsory arbitration, and an interview with John Perkins, assistant director of Cope, on voter registration. All on Cope Report.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
The essential question raised by these proposals is whether the government should be granted the authority to fix wages, hours, and working conditions for employees even in privately owned sectors of the economy through some form of compulsory arbitration. As a matter of basic principle, the AFL-CIO is firmly and unequivocally opposed to any such attempt to undermine free collective bargaining or the right to strike, which is essential to collective bargaining. We regard compulsory arbitration of emergency disputes as an anti-labor measure masquerading as public interest legislation, and we intend to fight it with all the strength at our command.
Taking the right to strike away from workers would have a disastrous effect on collective bargaining.
Those who know labor management relations recognize without exception that the right of labor to negotiate with management is an empty promise without the right to strike. Employers are not philanthropists. In general, they seek to hold on to the privileges and profits which have traditionally been theirs, and they rarely, if ever, comply with their employees' demands simply because they are just. By and large, employers pay no more than their employees' bargaining power requires them to pay. And employees' bargaining power turns, of course, on the availability of the right to strike, the basic economic weapon available to labor.
It is no secret that compulsory arbitration legislation is designed to protect employers, while at the same time showing little concern for workers.
While the various proposals to bar so-called national emergency strikes show a lively concern for pulling the chestnuts out of the fire for employers who face strong unions, these bills reflect no similar concern for employees who are condemned to second-class status because the law as it presently stands deprives them of meaningful economic power. The portions of the National Labor Relations Act which are meant to foster the bargaining power of underpaid workers have not been strengthened since 1935, even though experience has amply demonstrated that the Act as it now stands is no match for example, the great textile employees such as J.P. Stevens Company. But since it is employees rather than employers who suffer in those cases, the administration is content to adopt a policy of benign neglect. This one-sided approach is symptomatic of the overall pro-employer, anti-labor thrust of this administration.
But organized labor knows that when a national emergency is threatened, there must be some protection for the public. This can be provided without taking away the workers' right to strike. President Meany explains.
Assuming that a national emergency is in fact threatened, it is our view that the proper approach for Congress is to regulate the right to strike in a manner which will assure that sufficient goods and services are provided, so that the strike's side effects will be limited to an acceptable level from the standpoint of safeguarding national health and safety. This is the approach adopted in the Williams Bill S-832, which we fully support. For once the emergency element is extracted, the sole alleged justification for further regulation of the dispute disappears. There is then no occasion for government dictation of the terms of the eventual settlement between the parties.
Proponents of compulsory arbitration say they have a new gimmick to make it work: final offer selection.
Final offer selection is the latest example of this administration's penchant for government by gimmickry. This novel proposal was tried in the Weimar Republic with little success and abandoned. We see no reason to suppose that either the passage of 50 years or a change in scene of a few thousand miles has improved the idea. For it is one which could only appeal to those who know little of and care less about collective bargaining. This argument for final selection is that, as opposed to other systems of compulsory arbitration, it will drive the parties together rather than apart, because of their fear of the consequences if they do not agree, and if the other side's offer is deemed more reasonable. The concept of coercing agreement affecting their most vital interest by subjecting the parties to what is in the essence a flip of a coin is, to be polite, incredibly frivolous.
voter participation in elections in the United States is distressingly low. Only about 61% of America's 140 million eligible voters will cast ballots this year. The AFL-CIO has supported efforts to make voter registration easier. John Perkins, Assistant Director of COPE, explains one voter registration proposal.
Approximately between 45 and 30 days before the general election, federal general elections, a double postcard would be sent to each postal patron. Simply by filling out the postcard, which was pre-addressed, prepaid, they could tear it apart, send one half in to the local registration office, and if they met other state requirements, such as residency, age, so forth, they would be enrolled to participate in federal elections. Equally important, it provided more of an administrative study group to offer suggestions to help states in making uniform and standardized election procedures, the gathering of election data, the handling of problems that states' local election boards are faced with.
Opposition to registration by mail comes basically from Republicans and conservative Southerners. Mr. Perkins explains.
Postcard registration or mail registration would obviously mean that there would be more people going to the polls. Many of these people would be minorities. Some of the incumbent senators from the South were quite concerned about how these minorities were going to be voting if they were enrolled. Equally, I think the Republican Party and the administration was concerned because of the results of registration with the youth, that they were registering heavily, 5 to 6 to 1 in the Democratic Party, and they were concerned about making it easier for these people to register by mail, what the results or what their impact at the election in November would be.
A few states make a direct effort to register all the voters, and as a result have a high voter turnout at the polls.
Idaho, for example, the registration figures in 1970, of the potential voters, 88.4% were registered, and they were registered for two reasons. One, they have precinct registration, where the deputy registrar is allowed to go door to door to register, and the deputy registrar is paid, I think, 50 cents per head for every new enrolled potential voter that they enroll. Registration only closes 2 days before the elections in Idaho, so in the heat of the campaign, where the interest is at the highest, people are still allowed to enroll in the state of Idaho. Now, the enrollment and registration is directly related to the turnout. In Idaho, they voted some 67.2% in 70, which was an off-year election. In 1968, in the presidential election, the registration figures exceeded 90% in Idaho, and the turnout was in the 70s. So I think basically where the government does face up to its responsibilities, the people will act, or react, I should say. Now, on the other hand, a state like South Carolina, we only had 59.5%. Less than 60% of the potential voters were registered in 1970, simply again because there was no precinct registration. One had to appear in person during courthouse hours in order to enroll, and of course registration closed early.
Registration laws have restricted voter participation, but there was a time when registration in America was less restrictive and more people voted.
During the 19th century, there were no registration laws in the United States. I don't know whether it was because people were not concentrated in metropolitan areas, the theory that fewer voters or less population, that people were more honest then. But if you examine the turnouts in the 19th century, we found that in presidential elections that we were turning out 70 to 82%. Now, since we started registration laws, since we've made it difficult for people to appear before the registration commissions and enroll, we found that our registration potential is going down, and of course this is directly reflected in the turnout on Election Day.
Compulsory arbitration and voter registration, two issues that concern labor and you. On side 2 of this cassette, AFL-CIO President George Meany examines the Nixon record.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Which side are you on?